The morning sun filtered through Emma Rodriguez's bedroom window, casting golden streaks across her pale pink walls. It was a Tuesday in early March, exactly 6 months and 2 days since Emma Rodriguez had spoken her last word. That word had been no, shouted defiantly at her father as he stormed out of their family home for what everyone, including 9-year-old Emma, knew would be the final time. She hadn't spoken since. Her mother, Carolina Rodriguez, stood in the doorway watching her daughter with the expression of someone who had aged 10 years in the span of 6 months. Emma sat on her bed, her legs crossed beneath her, her attention entirely focused on Scout, her golden retriever and in many ways her only true friend in this fractured world. The dog's head rested in her lap, and Emma's slender fingers moved rhythmically through his silken fur, a gesture that had become almost meditative for her. In the quiet moments before school, before the whispered conversations between her mother and lawyers, before the court-appointed therapists probing questions, this was where Emma existed, in this bubble of unconditional acceptance that only Scout could provide. "Mija, we need to get ready," Carolina said softly, using the Spanish diminutive she'd called her daughter since birth. But Emma didn't respond. She simply looked up with eyes that had become disturbingly vacant over the past months, her gaze reflecting a sadness no child should ever carry. Carolina had long since stopped expecting verbal responses. Dr. Patricia Winters, the court-appointed psychologist, had explained it clearly during their initial consultation. Emma had developed selective mutism, a psychological condition where individuals lose the ability to speak in certain situations due to severe anxiety. Emma could speak. Her mother had heard her whisper to Scout late at night when she thought everyone was asleep, but something in her traumatized mind had decided that words were too dangerous, too likely to be used against her, too capable of making things worse. Emma pulled Scout closer, burying her face briefly in his neck. The dog was more than just a pet to her. He was her therapist, her confidant, her witness to all the things she couldn't say aloud. Scout had been part of their family for 3 years, a gift from Emma's grandfather on her 6th birthday. The retriever had always been gentle, but after the separation began, something shifted in his behavior. Dogs, it seemed, could sense emotional earthquakes before any human could measure them on their scale. Scout became hypervigilant, always positioning himself near Emma, always aware of her physical and emotional state. When Emma's anxiety spiked, Scout's ears would perk up. When her breathing became shallow during the night, the dog would move closer, his warm body a living pressure blanket against her trembling form. The truth about Emma's silence was far more complex than selective mutism. She wasn't mute because she physically couldn't speak. She was mute because she had learned, through painful experience, that words had consequences. Her father, Marcus Rodriguez, had used her innocent comments against her mother in mediation sessions. Something Emma had mentioned casually about her mother being tired had been twisted into evidence of maternal negligence. A comment about her father's new girlfriend had been weaponized into claims that Emma was being coached to resent the woman. Every word from Emma's mouth had become ammunition in her parents' war, and so she had simply stopped providing ammunition. Silence, she had discovered, was the only safe language. But with Scout, silence wasn't necessary. The dog understood without words. When Emma whispered her fears into his golden fur at 2 in the morning, Scout's tail would thump softly against the mattress. When she confessed that she loved her father despite his betrayal, the dog licked her tears without judgment. When she admitted that she was terrified of the upcoming custody trial, terrified that she would have to testify, terrified that whatever she said would hurt one parent or the other, terrified that she would be forced to choose between the 2 people she loved most, Scout simply pressed his body against hers, offering the wordless reassurance that she wasn't alone. The custody battle had intensified dramatically in recent weeks. Emma's father, frustrated by her refusal to speak, had begun pushing harder for a court-ordered evaluation. He believed, or claimed to believe, that Emma's mother had coached her into silence as a way to gain sympathy from a judge. He'd hired an expensive psychologist who specialized in parental alienation cases, someone who'd testify that Carolina had deliberately damaged Emma's ability to communicate with her father as a strategic custody move. The accusations had become increasingly vicious. Letters flew between lawyers. Depositions were scheduled and rescheduled. Medical bills mounted. And through it all, Emma retreated further into silence. The court had finally granted Marcus Rodriguez his request. Emma would be evaluated by a panel of psychologists. She would be questioned about her relationship with both parents. And most terrifyingly, she would be required to testify in front of Judge Patricia Henderson, a woman known throughout Ohio's judicial system for her icy demeanor and zero tolerance for what she called histrionic behavior. Judge Henderson had already made clear in preliminary hearings that she expected Emma to speak, regardless of her psychological condition. Children's voices need to be heard, the judge had declared coldly. What she didn't understand, what she couldn't possibly understand without witnessing it, was that Emma's silence was itself a voice, a powerful statement about the damage that adult conflict could inflict on the most innocent among them. Emma's therapist, Dr. Winters, had fought valiantly against the court order. She'd submitted extensive documentation about selective mutism, about the counterproductive nature of forcing a traumatized child to testify, about the additional psychological damage such testimony could cause. But Judge Henderson had overruled her objections. The trial was scheduled for 1 month away, and Emma would testify. The date loomed over the household like a storm cloud that refused to pass. It was this knowledge, this impending nightmare, that made Emma hold Scout so tightly that morning, because Emma knew something that the lawyers, the judges, the psychologists, and even her own mother didn't fully understand. She knew that Scout wasn't just her dog, he was her lifeline, and she had a plan. During her sessions with Dr. Winters, they had been working on something called grounding techniques, physical methods to help Emma manage her anxiety when words failed her. They developed a subtle hand signal, a small circular gesture near her heart, that would communicate to Scout that she needed his help. Scout had been trained to respond to this signal by applying deep pressure therapy, using his weight and presence to calm her nervous system. It was a technique that had helped Emma through countless panic attacks in the safety of her home and her therapist's office. But what Dr. Winters didn't know, what nobody knew except Scout, was that Emma planned to use this signal in court. She planned to have Scout demonstrate their bond in front of Judge Henderson, to show through their silent communication what no words ever could, that this child needed her dog, needed stability, needed her parents to stop fighting and start healing. It was a desperate plan, possibly futile, certainly risky, but Emma had nothing left to lose. As Carolina called out again that they needed to leave for school, Emma stood slowly, Scout rising alongside her as if they were connected by an invisible tether. She caught her reflection in the mirror, a small, pale girl with dark hair and frightened eyes, paired with a golden dog whose expression suggested infinite patience and unconditional love. She didn't know that in 1 month, in a courtroom filled with lawyers and judges and court reporters, this moment of connection would be the most powerful testimony anyone had ever witnessed. She didn't know that her silence, amplified through Scout's presence, would echo through the American legal system in ways no one could have predicted. She only knew that she had a dog who loved her, and that sometimes, when words betray you, love is the only language that matters. The Ohio District Courthouse stood like a monument to justice on the corner of 5th and Main, its gray limestone facade intimidating in the pale morning light. But to 9-year-old Emma Rodriguez, it looked less like a temple of fairness and more like a fortress designed to contain human suffering. She sat rigidly in the backseat of her mother's Honda Civic, Scout's head resting on her lap, his brown eyes watching the building with the same apprehension that radiated from his human companion. It was 8:47 a.m. on March 15th, 13 minutes before the Rodriguez custody case would be called to order, and Emma's hands trembled so violently that she could barely maintain her grip on Scout's collar. Carolina Rodriguez's knuckles were white as she gripped the steering wheel, her jaw clenched so tightly that a muscle twitched visibly in her cheek. She'd been awake since 3 a.m., cycling through layers of anxiety that ranged from terror to fury and back again. She wore a navy blazer and white blouse, professional, she hoped, but not intimidating. She'd been advised by her attorney, David Chen, to project quiet strength, to appear like the stable, nurturing parent that Emma truly needed. But inside, she felt like a woman whose entire world was being dismantled by a man she'd once loved, in a building filled with people who didn't know her daughter, and didn't care about anything except the mechanical application of family law. David Chen sat in the passenger seat, reviewing his case file one last time. At 48 years old, with silver threading through his black hair, Chen carried the weight of 23 years of family law experience. He'd seen countless custody battles, and they all followed the same depressing pattern. Two people who'd once chosen each other, now trying to destroy each other's credibility in the eyes of the law. But he'd also seen children caught in the crossfire, and Emma's case had gotten under his skin in a way that most cases didn't. He'd read every report from Dr. Winters. He'd studied the psychological literature on selective mutism, and he was deeply, profoundly concerned about what was about to happen. "Has Emma eaten anything this morning?" he asked Carolina without looking up from his files. "A few bites of toast," Carolina replied, her voice hollow. She threw up the rest. Chen closed his eyes briefly, processing this information, vomiting from anxiety in a 9-year-old. He'd warned the judge that forcing Emma to testify was cruel, that it would cause additional psychological damage. Judge Patricia Henderson had dismissed his concerns with a wave of her hand and a coldly stated position. "The child's voice needs to be heard, Mr. Chen. I will not allow a parent to hide behind a child's psychological condition to prevent the truth from emerging." The truth? Chen almost laughed bitterly at the word. What was truth in a custody case? It was whatever narrative could be supported by the most convincing evidence, presented by the most persuasive attorney, believed by a judge who had only a few hours to make a decision that would affect a child for the rest of her life. Truth had nothing to do with it. The courthouse hallway smelled of linseed oil, old wood, and the indefinable scent of desperation that seemed to emanate from the families waiting outside various courtrooms. Emma walked between her mother and David Chen, Scout's leash held loosely in her hand. She'd worn her best dress, a light blue thing with white buttons that her grandmother had sent from California, and her mother had braided her hair carefully that morning, a ritual that had taken 20 minutes and involved Carolina trying not to cry as she wove her daughter's silken strands together. Other people stared as they walked past. A girl in a pretty dress, a woman with red-rimmed eyes, a man in an expensive suit, and a golden retriever. It was an unusual combination for a courthouse, which was precisely why Emma and Scout had been granted permission to proceed together. Dr. Winters's documentation had been extensive and, thankfully, persuasive enough to overcome initial judicial resistance. Scout was listed as an emotional support animal, and there were strict protocols about such animals in court proceedings. But Judge Henderson had grudgingly allowed it, with the caveat that Scout would remain silent and unobtrusive during the proceedings. They entered courtroom 7C at 8:59 a.m. Emma's father was already there, seated at the opposite table with his attorney Dalton Price. Price was a different breed of lawyer than David Chen, younger, hungrier, and utterly willing to use any advantage, no matter how small. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Emma's mother made in a month, and his smile when he saw Carolina enter was the smile of a predator who'd caught the scent of blood in the water. Marcus Rodriguez looked thinner than he had 6 months ago. Divorce, Emma thought distantly, seemed to be consuming him from the inside out. He'd lost weight, his hair had grown shaggy, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he wasn't sleeping well. For a moment, just a moment, Emma felt a flash of sympathy for him. He was her father after all. She loved him despite everything. But then she remembered the things she'd heard through the walls of her mother's apartment, the things her therapist had helped her process, the accusations, the cruelty, the way her father had used her own words against her mother. The sympathy faded. Marcus stood when Emma entered, and for a moment his expression softened. He looked at his daughter with something that resembled genuine love. He started to move toward her, but David Chen subtly positioned himself between them, and Marcus stopped. The message was clear. This was a courtroom, not a family reunion. Judge Patricia Henderson entered at exactly 9:00 a.m., and the courtroom rose in unison. She was a tall woman in her early 60s, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain around her neck. She carried herself with the absolute authority of someone who had spent decades making life-altering decisions about other people's families. She did not look at Emma. She did not acknowledge Scout. She simply took her seat, opened her case file, and began speaking in a clipped, businesslike tone. "The case of Rodriguez versus Rodriguez, custody determination," she announced. "This hearing has been called to determine primary custodial rights for the minor child, Emma Rodriguez, age 9. Both parties are present, along with their respective counsel. The minor child is also present with her emotional support animal, which I have permitted based on documented psychological needs. Let the record show that this proceeding is being recorded and transcribed. We will proceed with opening arguments from counsel." Dalton Price stood immediately, and his opening statement was designed to be devastating. He outlined, with damning precision, the ways in which Marcus claimed Carolina had damaged the parent-child relationship. He presented emails, carefully selected and emphasized out of context, in which Carolina had supposedly made negative comments about Marcus to friends. He referenced an incident 6 months ago when Emma had mentioned to her father that her mother seemed sad all the time, which Price spun into evidence that Carolina was neglecting her emotional needs. He spoke for 20 minutes without once looking at Emma, treating her as though she were a piece of property being fought over rather than a human being sitting in the courtroom, trembling. David Chen's opening statement was quieter, more measured, focused on Emma's psychological needs and the documented negative effects of custody battles on children with anxiety disorders. But his words seemed to fade against the intensity of Price's accusations. Judge Henderson listened with an expression of absolute neutrality, her pen moving across her legal pad in rapid, decisive strokes. The first witness was called, a psychologist hired by Marcus, Dr. Robert Feldman, who specialized in parental alienation cases. He testified, with the confidence of someone who'd been paid substantial money for his conclusions, that Emma's selective mutism was almost certainly a symptom of maternal programming. He used terms like custodial interference and psychological manipulation, with the ease of someone delivering a scripted performance. Carolina gripped David Chen's arm so hard her nails left marks. Emma stared at her hands. Scout's ears perked up at the tension in the room, his body tensing in response to the anxiety radiating from his human. Then it was the mother's turn. Carolina's psychologist, Dr. Patricia Winters, testified about the genuine, documented effects of parental conflict on children. She explained selective mutism in clinical terms, presented research studies showing how forced testimony could permanently damage a child's psychological recovery, and made a passionate plea for Emma's mental health to take priority over legal maneuvering. But Dalton Price's cross-examination was brutal. He suggested that Dr. Winters had become too invested in Carolina's narrative. He implied that her testimony was biased. He attacked her credibility with the skill of someone who'd done this 100 times before. By the time she stepped down from the witness stand, Dr. Winters looked shaken, and Caroline looked devastated. The morning progressed in this manner, argument following argument, accusation following accusation. The courtroom became a battleground where two adults fought over their child while that child sat in silent agony, her only comfort the warm presence of her dog beneath the table. Scout's head rested against her feet, offering the only reassurance available in a room filled with hostility. By noon, when Judge Henderson called for a brief recess, Emma's anxiety had reached critical levels. She hadn't eaten, hadn't spoken, hadn't moved except to breathe. And in the afternoon session, everyone knew what was coming. Emma would be called to testify. The courthouse cafeteria smelled like industrial cleaning supplies and stale coffee. Emma sat across from her mother, a turkey sandwich in front of her that she had no intention of eating. Her stomach felt like it had been replaced with a ball of barbed wire, each movement causing sharp, shooting pains that made her want to curl into herself. Around them, other people navigated the cafeteria with the casual normalcy of those whose lives weren't about to be dissected in front of a judge and court reporter. Emma envied them with an intensity that surprised her. Carolina had barely touched her own lunch. She'd spent the first half hour of the recess on the phone with David Chen, their conversation happening in urgent whispers in a corner of the courthouse lobby while Emma sat on a bench with Scout, trying to make herself invisible. Now, back at the lunch table, Carolina reached across and squeezed her daughter's hand. "We're almost done, Mija," she said, though they both knew it was a lie. They weren't almost done. In fact, the worst part was just beginning. Back in chambers, Judge Henderson sat behind her desk reviewing case notes. David Chen had filed an emergency motion requesting that Emma's testimony be postponed until she was psychologically prepared, which was to say, never, because Emma would never be psychologically prepared to testify in a custody case. The motion was, as Chen had known it would be, summarily denied. Judge Henderson's written response was characteristically cold. "The child's testimony is material to this case. Delaying the proceeding to accommodate the child's anxiety would constitute an abuse of the court's discretion. The motion is denied." What the judge didn't understand, what she seemed fundamentally incapable of understanding, was that forcing Emma to testify wasn't about hearing the truth. It was about giving Dalton Price an opportunity to weaponize a 9-year-old girl's words against her mother. And that was exactly what Price had planned. Price had spent the lunch hour reviewing his cross-examination strategy with Marcus in a consultation room down the hall. The strategy was simple and devastating. Get Emma on the stand. Ask her carefully crafted questions designed to elicit statements that could be interpreted as criticism of her mother. Then use those statements to argue that Emma's mother had damaged the parent-child relationship. Emma would be trapped between her genuine love for her mother and her desire to please an authority figure asking her questions. Whatever she said, Price could twist it. Marcus had seemed uncertain about this approach during their strategy session. "I don't want to hurt Emma," he'd said, his voice carrying something that sounded almost like doubt. Price had dismissed his concern with the callousness of a man who'd never had to live with the consequences of his legal tactics. "This is custody, Marcus. Emma will recover. What matters is that you get the primary custody arrangement you're entitled to." Without her testimony, the judge might award equal custody, which essentially gives your ex-wife a veto over all major decisions. You need Emma to establish that her mother has turned her against you. Never mind that this wasn't actually true. Never mind that Emma's silence had nothing to do with her mother poisoning her against her father. In the world of litigation, perception was reality, and a skilled attorney could shape perception however he needed to. At 1:15 p.m., the courtroom reconvened. Judge Henderson took her seat with the same efficiency she displayed that morning, as though the lunch break had been merely a brief pause in a film being projected for her benefit. Emma was escorted to her seat by a bailiff, Scout beside her on a carefully positioned dog bed that the court had agreed to allow in the courtroom during her testimony. The dog sensed the escalation in Emma's anxiety immediately. His ears flattened against his head, and his breathing became shallow, mirroring the physiological distress of his human. "Before we proceed with the minor child's testimony," Judge Henderson said, looking up from her file, "I want to establish some ground rules. Emma, you will be sworn to tell the truth. You understand that this is a serious matter, yes?" Emma nodded mutely. She couldn't trust her voice not to betray her, not to crack and break under the weight of what was being asked of her. The bailiff administered the oath, asking Emma to place her hand on a Bible and swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Emma's hand shook as she repeated the words in barely a whisper. The entire courtroom had to strain to hear her. Then Dalton Price approached, his expensive suit catching the fluorescent light in a way that made him look powerful and polished and utterly terrifying to a 9-year-old girl who was already barely holding herself together. He smiled at Emma, a smile clearly designed to put her at ease but which, to Emma, looked like the smile of a shark preparing to feed. "Hello, Emma," he began, his voice gentle and measured. "I'm Mr. Price. I'm going to ask you some questions today, and I need you to answer them as honestly as you can. Can you do that for me?" Emma nodded, her throat constricting. "Let's start with something easy," Price continued. "Tell me about your home life with your mother. How are things at home?" It was a seemingly innocent question, but it was a trap. Whatever Emma said would be potential ammunition. If she said things were good, Price would ask why then. Did she have such severe anxiety? If she said things were difficult, he could use that to argue that her mother wasn't providing adequate emotional support. There was no correct answer. Emma's hands began to tremble. Her vision tunneled slightly, the way it did when panic was approaching. She looked toward her mother, seeking reassurance, but David Chen subtly shook his head, a warning that any sign of coaching from the mother's side of the courtroom would be used against them. "Things are," Emma began, her voice barely audible, then stopped. The words felt dangerous in her mouth. Words had power. Words could hurt people. She'd learned this over 6 months of careful silence. "Take your time," Price said, with the false kindness of someone performing compassion for an audience. The judge was watching. The court reporter was recording. Everything Emma said would be part of the permanent record of this case, potentially to be used against her mother for years to come. "Things are okay," Emma finally managed, her voice so quiet that the court reporter asked her to repeat herself. "Okay," Price repeated, seizing on the word. "Not good, not wonderful, just okay." "Good," Emma corrected, desperately trying to fix her mistake, but the damage was done. Price had already established that Emma's home life with her mother was merely okay, not ideal. "And does your mother ever talk to you about your father?" Price asked. Carolina's attorney, David Chen, immediately stood. "Objection. Calls for speculation regarding conversations protected by privilege and is leading." "Sustained," Judge Henderson said, but her tone suggested she'd have allowed the question if it had been phrased differently. Price rephrased, "Does your mother ever say things about your father?" Emma felt sweat beginning to accumulate on her palms. She knew what her mother said about her father, that he'd been unfaithful, that he'd been cruel, that he'd broken their family apart. But she also knew that if she testified to hearing these things, it would be used as evidence that her mother was alienating her from her father. She was trapped between honesty and self-preservation. "Sometimes," Emma whispered. "Can you give me an example?" Price pressed, moving in for the kill. By this point, Emma's panic was accelerating dramatically. Her breathing had become shallow and rapid. Her chest felt tight, as though invisible hands were squeezing her ribs. The courtroom had begun to spin slightly around her. She could feel the weight of everyone's attention, the judge's expectant gaze, the court reporter's pen moving across her machine, her father's barely concealed hope that his daughter would say something he could use against her mother's terrified expression as she realized what was happening. Scout, positioned on his bed beneath the witness stand, was alert to every sign of Emma's distress. His body had gone rigid. His eyes, usually soft and gentle, had sharpened with focus. He knew what was coming. He'd been trained for exactly this moment, a moment when the person he loved most needed him to intervene, to provide grounding, to anchor her to reality when her mind was spiraling into panic. Emma's fingers gripped the edge of the witness stand. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run. She wanted to disappear entirely. But she couldn't do any of those things because she was trapped in a courtroom with lawyers and judges and the machinery of the legal system, all of which seemed determined to use her as a weapon in a war she hadn't started and didn't understand. "Emma," Price prompted, his pen poised over his legal pad, waiting to record whatever words she might say that he could later twist into evidence of parental alienation. But Emma couldn't speak. The words had turned to ash in her mouth. Her vision was tunneling further now, her body beginning to slip into that dissociative state that happened when trauma became too much to process. She was starting to check out, to disappear into herself, to abandon her own testimony because the cost of speaking was too high. This was the moment. This was the psychological weapon that had been aimed at her since the moment her parents decided to split apart, and Emma was about to break entirely under its weight. Scout's body tensed beneath the witness stand, every muscle prepared to move. Emma's heart was beating so fast that she could see her chest moving visibly beneath her blue dress. Boom, 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 boom. Not the steady, reassuring rhythm of a heart at rest, but the frantic percussion of an organ in distress, as though her body understood something her mind hadn't yet fully processed. She was in danger, real danger, and every instinct she possessed was screaming at her to flee. Dalton Price was still waiting for his answer, his pen poised, his expression one of practiced patience that barely concealed the predatory nature beneath. "Emma, I asked if you could give me an example of something your mother said about your father. Can you do that?" The words hung in the air like a noose. Emma understood, with the clarity that sometimes comes to children in moments of extreme stress, that whatever she said next would matter. It would become part of the record. It would be analyzed by lawyers and psychologists, and a judge who'd already demonstrated her belief that Emma's silence was a symptom of maternal programming rather than genuine trauma. Behind the prosecutor's table, Marcus Rodriguez leaned forward slightly, his jaw clenched with anticipation. He wanted his daughter to say something damaging about her mother. Not consciously, perhaps, Marcus still loved Carolina somewhere deep in his heart, beneath the rage and betrayal and wounded pride. But the part of him that was fighting to win, the part that had been poisoned by Dalton Price's rhetoric about parental rights and custody percentages, that part wanted Emma to validate his narrative. That part needed her to confirm that Carolina had weaponized her against him. Emma opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Her hands, gripping the edge of the witness stand so tightly her knuckles had turned white, began to shake with a tremor that suggested she might snap in half at any moment. I don't remember," she finally whispered. It was a lie, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. But it was the lie of a child trying to survive, and that survival instinct was the only thing keeping her from completely shattering. "You don't remember," Price repeated, his tone shifting to something that sounded almost sympathetic but carried an edge of disbelief. "Emma, that's interesting. Just a moment ago, you told me that your mother sometimes says things about your father, and now you're telling me you can't remember any specific examples. That seems a bit convenient, doesn't it?" David Chen stood abruptly. Objection, argumentative and harassing the witness. "Sustained," Judge Henderson said, but her expression suggested she agreed with Price's implication. The judge's cold, gray eyes fixed on Emma with something that looked like disappointment, as though she'd expected better from this child who'd been brought before her. Emma's vision was definitely tunneling now. The edges of her awareness had begun to blur, the courtroom narrowing down to a pinpoint of sensation, centered on the witness stand where she was being systematically dismantled by an attorney who'd been paid specifically to do this. She could feel the pressure building in her chest, the tightness in her throat that preceded the kind of panic attack that sometimes made her black out entirely. Scout shifted on his bed beneath the witness stand, his entire muscular frame transitioning from a state of alert rest into something more active, more purposeful. His brown eyes, which had been tracking Emma's distress signals since she'd entered the courtroom that morning, were now locked onto her with laser focus. The dog could read the signs of an impending panic attack in Emma with the same precision that a cardiologist could read an EKG. He knew the pattern. He'd witnessed it countless times during their therapy sessions with Dr. Winters. First came the facial flushing and the trembling hands, check already present. Then came the rapid, shallow breathing that made the sufferer feel as though they were drowning in air. Check. Emma's breath had become increasingly rapid over the past few minutes. Then came the dissociation, the sense of separating from one's body, of watching oneself from outside, as though the consciousness was hovering several feet above the physical form and observing what was happening to that form with the detached interest of a stranger. Scout could sense that Emma was approaching this stage. Her eyes had taken on a slightly glazed quality. Her grip on the witness stand had loosened marginally, as though her hands were beginning to forget that they were supposed to maintain contact with the wood. "Let me ask you something else," Price continued, relentless in his pursuit. He'd sensed weakness, and lawyers like Dalton Price were trained to exploit weakness the way sharks exploited blood in the water. "Emma, do you love your father?" It was a question designed to make her emotional, to crack the fragile control she was maintaining. And it worked. Emma's eyes filled with tears, her lower lip beginning to quiver. "Yes," she said, the single word coming out as more of a sob. "But you haven't spoken to him in 6 months, have you?" Price pressed. "Objection." David Chen was on his feet again, his voice rising with frustration. "That's argumentative, speculative, and the witness has already established that she has a documented psychological condition. Counsel is deliberately triggering a panic response in a child." "Sustained," Judge Henderson said, her tone suggesting irritation that Chen was making a scene in her courtroom rather than genuine concern for Emma's well-being. "Mr. Price, rephrase your question without the editorializing." But the damage was already done. Emma was beginning to hyperventilate, her small chest heaving with breaths that were too shallow, too rapid, pulling oxygen into her lungs faster than her body could process it. She felt dizzy. The courtroom had begun to rotate slowly around her, as though she were standing on a spinning platform. She wanted to cry out, but her voice had abandoned her entirely. The selective mutism that had protected her for 6 months now becoming a prison from which she couldn't escape. Scout's entire body went rigid, every muscle tensed, his ears pinned flat against his head. The dog had made a decision, though he was still waiting for the signal, the one specific gesture that Emma had taught him, the one that would release him from his obligation to remain calm and patient on his bed. Carolina watched her daughter's deterioration with the expression of a woman whose heart was being torn out of her chest. She started to stand, to move toward her child, but David Chen placed a firm hand on her arm, restraining her. Any intervention from the mother now would be used as evidence of coaching, of attempt to manipulate Emma's testimony. "Emma," Judge Henderson said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade of ice, "I need you to pull yourself together. Can you do that?" It was perhaps the cruelest thing anyone could have said to a child in the midst of a psychological crisis. The instruction to pull yourself together assumes that the person receiving it has the ability to do so, assumes that their emotional regulation is a matter of will rather than neurochemistry, assumes that if they're falling apart it's because they're not trying hard enough to stay together. Emma tried. God, she tried. She attempted to regulate her breathing, to slow her racing heart, to reconnect with her body which seemed to be floating somewhere above her, observing her suffering with clinical detachment. But she couldn't. The panic had taken over now, commandeering her nervous system completely, and there was nothing in her conscious mind that could override it. She gripped the edge of the witness stand again, this time not for support but out of a desperate need to anchor herself to something solid, something real, something that would convince her that the world wasn't dissolving into chaos around her. Her entire body was shaking now. The blue dress that her grandmother had sent from California was soaked with sweat. Her vision had tunneled so much that she could barely see anything except a small, circular patch of the world directly in front of her. This was the moment, the tipping point. In the next 30 seconds, Emma would either recover slightly from this panic attack, or she would lose consciousness entirely, would dissociate so completely that she would cease to function as a conscious being in this courtroom. Scout watched and waited, every cell of his body vibrating with readiness. Judge Henderson leaned forward slightly, preparing to say something else, some other instruction designed to compel a child to control her own neurochemistry through sheer force of will. And then Emma made the decision that would change everything. Her right hand, trembling violently, began to move toward her chest. It was a small gesture, barely perceptible to anyone who didn't know to look for it. A circular motion made near her heart, the signal that she and Scout had practiced hundreds of times. The signal that meant, "I need you. I need help. I'm drowning." Scout's muscles, coiled tighter than springs, finally released. Time seemed to slow down in the instant that Emma's trembling hand completed the circular gesture near her heart. The motion was so small, so subtle, that most people in the courtroom would later swear they hadn't seen it at all. But Scout saw it. Scout had been waiting for it, had been coiled and ready, had been poised on the edge of action for the past 10 minutes as his human deteriorated before his eyes. The golden retriever moved with a grace and purpose that belied his 100-pound frame. He didn't trot. He didn't walk casually toward the witness stand. Scout launched himself forward with the precision of an athlete who'd trained for this exact moment, his powerful muscles propelling his body across the courtroom floor in what took perhaps 3 seconds, but which felt, to everyone watching, like a slow-motion sequence from a film. The bailiff, stationed near the courtroom door, started to move toward Scout, his hand reaching out to intercept the dog. But something in Scout's bearing, some unmistakable signal of purpose and legitimate need, made the bailiff hesitate just long enough for the dog to reach his destination. Scout didn't jump on Emma. He didn't bark or whine or do anything that might have disrupted the courtroom further. Instead, he executed a movement that seemed to have been choreographed by someone far more intelligent than a dog, though Scout's intelligence in that moment seemed boundless. He placed his 2 front paws directly on the witness stand platform, his rear legs remaining on the ground, positioning himself so that his massive chest pressed directly against Emma's fragile frame. His head, positioned higher than her heart, came to rest against her shoulder and collarbone, his warm weight becoming an anchor, a pressure point, a living manifestation of grounding. Emma's hands, which had been grasping at the witness stand rail, found Scout's neck instead. Her fingers buried themselves in his soft fur, gripping with the desperation of a drowning person finding purchase on a piece of driftwood. And as Scout's presence settled against her, as his steady, rhythmic breathing began to synchronize with her own chaotic gasps, something shifted inside her nervous system. The effect was not instantaneous, but it was profound. Scout's deep pressure therapy, the same technique that had been practiced in Dr. Winters's office dozens of times, began to activate. The dog's weight on her chest, the gentle pressure of his body against hers, the warmth of his presence, all of these things began to send signals to Emma's parasympathetic nervous system, the part of her brain responsible for calming her down, for bringing her back from the edge of complete panic. The courtroom had frozen. Not paused, not simply become quiet, completely and utterly frozen, as though everyone present had been suddenly turned to stone by the impact of what they were witnessing. Judge Patricia Henderson's hand, which had been reaching for her gavel, hung suspended in midair. Her cold, efficient expression had been replaced by something raw and unguarded, shock, certainly, but also something deeper. Recognition, perhaps. The recognition that she was witnessing something that transcended the mechanical application of law. Dalton Price's pen had stopped moving across his legal pad. His mouth remained open, as though he'd been about to speak when the world had shifted on its axis. His predatory demeanor, the carefully cultivated appearance of a lawyer in control of a situation, had evaporated entirely. David Chen had also stopped mid-objection, his words dying in his throat as he witnessed what appeared to be a miracle unfolding in front of him. Though it wasn't a miracle at all, but rather the simple expression of unconditional love and carefully trained response compressed into a single moment of profound intervention. Carolina Rodriguez had her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes flooding with tears. She'd seen Scout perform his grounding techniques before, but she'd never seen it in a public setting, never seen it witnessed by people who didn't understand that what they were looking at was not a dog disobeying court orders, but rather a dog responding to a legitimate crisis, with the kind of instinctive intelligence that existed somewhere beyond what most people understood as animal behavior. The court reporter's fingers had stopped moving across her transcription machine. Even this woman, who'd been documenting the proceedings with mechanical precision, seemed to understand that something sacred was occurring in front of her, something that transcended the usual categories of legal procedure. Marcus Rodriguez, Emma's father, had tears streaming down his face. Whatever narrative he'd been constructing about his daughter being alienated from him, whatever story his attorney had convinced him to believe, collapsed entirely in the face of what he was seeing. His daughter wasn't silently accusing her mother. His daughter was in psychological crisis, and the only being in the entire courtroom who'd actually moved to help her was a dog. Scout's breathing continued to be slow and steady, a metronome of calm transmitted directly into Emma's body through the points of contact between them. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The rhythm that Scout had learned through countless training sessions, the rhythm that his body naturally adopted during deep pressure therapy, began to synchronize with Emma's increasingly stable breathing pattern. 30 seconds passed, 45 a minute. Emma's hyperventilation had begun to slow. Her death grip on Scout's fur had loosened slightly, becoming something less desperate and more relational. She buried her face in the dog's neck, inhaling the familiar scent of him, the specific combination of his shampoo and his natural dog smell that had become the olfactory definition of safety for her. "Oh my God," someone whispered from the gallery, one of the bailiffs or a court officer, their voice carrying a note of awe that seemed to encompass everything that was happening. Judge Henderson's suspended hand finally descended, but instead of bringing her gavel down in a gavel strike, the judge simply set it on her desk with unusual gentleness. She removed her reading glasses and set them down carefully beside the gavel. Then, in a gesture that was utterly unprecedented in her courtroom, she simply sat back in her chair and watched. What she was watching was the physical manifestation of something that all the expert testimony, all the psychological reports, all the carefully constructed legal arguments had been trying and failing to convey. A child in genuine distress, seeking comfort from the only being in her life who loved her without condition, without agenda, without the baggage of adult conflict and broken promises. Emma's breathing had stabilized now. The panic attack had not completely resolved. That would take more time, more calming presence, more of Scout's weight anchoring her to her body in the present moment. But the acute crisis had passed. The hyperventilation had slowed to something approaching normal respiration. The dissociation had reversed enough that she was present in her body again, conscious of the witness stand beneath her, the courtroom around her, Scout's weight pressing against her chest. Scout remained perfectly still, understanding with some deep canine wisdom that his job was not yet complete, that Emma still needed him exactly where he was, providing exactly what he was providing. His brown eyes were open, alert, watching Emma's face for any sign that the panic was returning, prepared to press harder against her if necessary, to provide whatever additional grounding she might require. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. No one was checking their phones. No one was shuffling papers. No one was preparing their next argument or searching for their next legal strategy. The entire room had been brought into a kind of collective meditation, focused entirely on a small girl and her dog. Judge Henderson stared at the scene in front of her with an expression that suggested she was witnessing something that would fundamentally alter how she understood her own role in the justice system. She'd spent 23 years on the bench, had made thousands of decisions affecting families, children, lives. And in this single moment, watching a 9-year-old communicate with her dog in a language beyond words, she seemed to be comprehending something that all her legal training had never quite managed to convey. That the law's purpose was not to win, not to establish whose narrative was correct, not to assign custody percentages and parental rights. The law's purpose was supposed to protect children, and this child, protected by her dog in ways that no court order could ever manage, had just demonstrated what protection actually looked like. Emma remained pressed against Scout, her small body rising and falling with the rhythm of his breathing, the signals of the panic attack slowly releasing their grip on her nervous system. The courtroom remained frozen, everyone processing what they'd just witnessed, not a legal proceeding, but a moment of genuine human and animal connection that had transcended every mechanical aspect of the justice system. This was the moment. This was the gesture that would echo through Ohio's court system and eventually across the nation, not because it had been clever or legally strategic, but because it had been true, profoundly, authentically, undeniably true. And in that truth, everything was about to change. Judge Patricia Henderson had spent 23 years on the bench, presiding over 847 custody cases. She could recite the relevant statutes from memory. She understood the complexities of parental rights, the nuances of child psychology as it related to custody determinations, the legal precedents that governed her decisions. She'd been lauded in legal journals for her efficiency, her ability to move cases through her courtroom with minimal delay, her unwillingness to tolerate what she called histrionic behavior from either parents or their children. But in this moment, watching a golden retriever comfort a traumatized 9-year-old girl, Judge Henderson was beginning to understand that efficiency and speed had perhaps not been the greatest virtues in a custody courtroom. She sat motionless in her elevated chair, her hands folded on the bench in front of her, her reading glasses resting beside her gavel. Around her, the machinery of the courtroom had ground to a halt. No one was speaking. No one was objecting. The court reporter had abandoned her transcription machine and was simply watching, tears streaming silently down her face. The bailiff stood frozen near the door, his hand no longer reaching toward Scout but instead hanging limply at his side. Emma remained pressed against Scout, and Scout remained exactly where he was, 100 pounds of unconditional presence, a living meditation on what love actually meant when stripped of all legal definition. Judge Henderson found herself thinking about her own daughter, Rebecca, who was now 42 years old and hadn't spoken to her mother in 7 years. Rebecca's childhood had been spent with a judge for a mother, a woman who prided herself on discipline, efficiency, and the clear-headed application of rules. Rebecca had later told her therapist, a therapist that Judge Henderson had never met, information she'd learned only through a mutual acquaintance, that growing up with such a woman had left her feeling that rules mattered more than relationships, that outcomes mattered more than presence, that winning mattered more than love. She'd been 17 when she'd asked her mother if Judge Henderson had ever considered that maybe, just maybe, a child needed her parent to be a person before she needed her to be a judge. Judge Henderson had responded, in her characteristic way, that sentimentality would not serve Rebecca well in the real world, and that she was doing her a favor by teaching her toughness rather than coddling her with emotional displays. Rebecca was now 42 and hadn't called her mother in 7 years. This thought, arising unbidden in Judge Henderson's mind, felt like a key turning in a lock. She'd spent her entire career making decisions that affected other people's families, while somehow managing to destroy her own in the process. She'd built a reputation for being tough, efficient, and unwilling to tolerate histrionic behavior. which was really just another way of saying she was unwilling to tolerate the normal emotional responses of human beings to extraordinary circumstances. And now, sitting in her courtroom, watching a child in genuine psychological distress being comforted by an animal in ways that no court order could ever accomplish, she was beginning to comprehend the magnitude of what she'd been missing. Emma's breathing had continued to stabilize. Scout's weight remained against her, his body still providing the deep pressure that her nervous system so desperately required. The dog's eyes were half closed now, suggesting a state of calm presence rather than alertness. He'd successfully brought his human back from the edge, had performed the exact function he'd been trained to perform, and now he was maintaining that therapeutic presence with the dedication of a professional who understood the gravity of his job. Judge Henderson found her voice, though when she spoke it sounded different to her own ears, quieter, more human, less judicial. "I think we're all seeing something very important right now," she said. It was not a statement she'd planned. It was not something that fit neatly into the judicial framework she'd been operating within for over 2 decades. It was simply an observation, spoken by a woman who'd suddenly glimpsed something profound about the nature of human suffering and the ways in which love could transcend every legal definition and procedural requirement. David Chen's hand, which had remained suspended in the air during the entire episode with Scout, slowly descended. Tears were streaming down his face as well. In his 23 years of family law practice, he'd argued countless times that judges needed to consider the emotional well-being of children above all else. He'd cited statistics about the psychological effects of custody battles. He'd presented research studies about the importance of stability and emotional support. He'd used every tool in his legal arsenal to convince judges that law was supposed to serve people, not the other way around. And now, finally, he had a judge who seemed to understand this not through argument or evidence, but through direct observation of a child being saved from psychological dissolution by her dog. Dalton Price, meanwhile, was experiencing something closer to professional horror. His carefully constructed cross-examination, his strategic manipulation of a traumatized child, his entire approach to this case suddenly appeared to him not as effective legal maneuvering, but as something approaching psychological abuse. He'd been hired to win a custody case, and he'd been willing to do it by systematically dismantling a 9-year-old's psychological stability. Watching Scout comfort Emma, Price was beginning to understand what he'd actually been doing. Carolina Rodriguez had moved her hand from her mouth and was now pressing both hands to her heart, as though trying to prevent it from bursting out of her chest. She was witnessing her daughter being helped, being saved, by the dog that had been her constant companion through this nightmare. And she was witnessing a judge, the same cold, efficient judge who denied every protective motion she'd filed, beginning to see her daughter as a human being rather than a legal case. Marcus Rodriguez had moved his chair back slightly and was openly weeping now, his carefully constructed armor of paternal rights and custody percentages crumbling entirely in the face of what he was witnessing. His daughter was suffering, genuinely and profoundly suffering, and he'd been so caught up in fighting his ex-wife that he'd failed to notice. Judge Henderson's eyes remained fixed on the scene in front of her. She was seeing a child and her dog engaged in a form of communication that predated language, that transcended the categories of human law and legal precedent. She was seeing something pure and uncorrupted by the machinery of the justice system. And she was beginning to understand that all the arguments she'd heard that morning, the carefully constructed narratives, the expert testimony, the legal precedents, had all been missing the point entirely. The point was not whether Emma's mother had coached her into silence. The point was not whether Emma's father had been unfaithful or whether the mother had made negative comments about the father. The point was that a child was drowning in adult conflict, and no legal mechanism had been created to save her until a dog had stepped in. Judge Henderson slowly stood from her chair. Everyone in the courtroom stiffened slightly, uncertain what was about to happen. The judge who'd been so cold, so efficient, so unmoved by emotional appeals, stood now looking at Emma and Scout with an expression of such profound sadness, an understanding that it seemed to redefine her entire character. "I think," she said slowly, her voice carrying a weight that seemed to reorganize the gravity in the room, "that we all need to step back and remember what this case is actually about." She paused, letting her gaze move from Emma to Scout to Carolina to Marcus to the lawyers standing in front of her. "This case is about a child, not about parental rights, not about custody percentages, not about who said what to whom. It's about a child who needs stability, who needs both of her parents, and who needs the adults in her life to stop fighting long enough to remember that they created this person, and that person's well-being should be the only thing that matters." Judge Henderson's voice had become stronger now, more certain, as though she was finally giving herself permission to speak from a place of authentic human understanding rather than from the rigid framework of judicial procedure. "I've made a grave mistake today," she continued, and everyone in the courtroom seemed to hold their breath. "I forced a traumatized child to testify in front of people who were prepared to use her words against her mother. I did this in the name of justice. I did this in the name of hearing the child's voice, but what I actually did was cause her additional psychological harm." She turned to her bailiff. "This courtroom is in recess until tomorrow morning. We are going to take the rest of today to remember what actually matters here." Then, doing something no one had ever seen a judge do in her courtroom, Judge Henderson descended from her bench and approached the witness stand where Emma remained pressed against Scout. The bailiff, understanding what was happening, stepped aside without protest. Judge Henderson looked at Emma and Scout for a long moment. Then, her stern judicial expression softening entirely, she said something that would later be quoted in legal journals across the country. "That dog just taught this entire courtroom what it means to truly listen to someone." Next 14 days were unlike anything Judge Patricia Henderson had experienced in her 23 years on the bench. She'd gone home that afternoon, sent her bailiffs away, and sat alone in her chambers for 3 hours, doing something she'd rarely done before, thinking. Not thinking about legal precedent or custody statutes or the carefully balanced framework of family law that had governed her career. Thinking, instead, about what she'd witnessed in her courtroom. A child being systematically dismantled by an attorney. A dog responding to that dismantling with more wisdom than any human in the room had demonstrated. A moment of pure, uncorrupted truth that had shattered every assumption she'd been operating under. That evening, Judge Henderson had made a decision that would have surprised no one who'd known her as the efficient, rule-bound jurist she'd been. She was going to recuse herself from this case. She would declare a conflict of interest based on her own emotional response to the proceedings and recommend that the case be reassigned to another judge. But then, unable to sleep, she'd spent the next 3 nights reading everything she could find about selective mutism, about the psychological effects of custody battles on children, about emotional support animals and their role in therapeutic intervention. She'd read Dr. Winters's reports in their entirety. She'd reviewed every piece of evidence in the case file with fresh eyes, no longer looking for evidence to support a particular custody arrangement, but looking instead for evidence of what would actually serve the child's well-being. By the 4th day, Judge Henderson had changed her mind. She wasn't going to recuse herself. She was going to issue a ruling that would reflect what she'd learned, not just from the legal documents, but from watching a golden retriever demonstrate more wisdom about human healing than she'd accumulated in 2 decades of judicial practice. She also did something she'd never done before. She called both attorneys into her chambers privately, without their clients present. David Chen arrived first, uncertain and slightly nervous. Judge Henderson's summons had been unusual, and he'd braced himself for criticism about his conduct during the trial. But the judge who greeted him was a different woman than the one who'd presided over the morning session. She was still professional, still judicial, but there was a softness to her that hadn't been present before. "Mr. Chen," she began, "I've been thinking about this case. I've been thinking about your client's child. And I need to tell you something that I should have recognized from the beginning but didn't. You were right. About all of it. Emma's testimony was harmful. Forcing her to testify was cruel. And I was so focused on procedure that I missed the actual human being in front of me." Chen had felt tears beginning to form, though he maintained his professional composure. "I'm going to issue an order," Judge Henderson continued, "that will require both parents to participate in family therapy. Immediate family therapy, not the kind that gets postponed indefinitely. And I'm going to implement a custody arrangement that prioritizes Emma's emotional stability above all else." When Dalton Price was called into chambers, the conversation was somewhat different. "Mr. Price," Judge Henderson said, her voice carrying an edge of steel beneath the civility, "I want to speak frankly about your conduct yesterday. Your cross-examination of a 9-year-old child who was experiencing a documented anxiety disorder was, in my judgment, designed to traumatize her into providing statements that could be used against her mother. That's not legal strategy. That's psychological abuse." Price had attempted to defend himself, but Judge Henderson had cut him off with a gesture. "I'm not going to sanction you," she continued. "Not because your conduct was appropriate, but because I bear responsibility for allowing it to continue. However, I want you to understand something very clearly. If I see this kind of conduct in my courtroom again, there will be consequences. We are officers of the court. That means we have an obligation to the human beings we represent, not just to winning." Price had left the chambers with his confidence thoroughly shaken. 2 weeks later, on a gray March morning that seemed to echo the morning that had brought everyone to court 14 days before, Judge Henderson was ready to issue her ruling. The courtroom was packed. Word of what had happened, a child's dog intervening in a custody hearing, a judge's apparent change of heart, had spread through Ohio's legal community. Other judges had shown up to watch. Law professors were present. Emma's case had become something approaching a local sensation, though the media's understanding of what had actually transpired was often confused and sensationalized. Emma sat between her mother and David Chen, Scout at her feet. She was still not speaking, but her anxiety levels had decreased noticeably over the past 2 weeks. She'd had 3 family therapy sessions with both her parents present, sessions that had been difficult and painful but also genuinely healing. For the first time in months, she'd heard her father acknowledge, in front of a therapist and her mother, that he'd been wrong to let the custody battle consume him, wrong to use her words against her mother, wrong to put her in the position of having to choose. She'd also heard her mother acknowledge her own mistakes, moments when she had, perhaps unconsciously, made negative comments about Emma's father within Emma's hearing. Moments when she'd let her own fear and betrayal influence how she talked about the man she'd once loved. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was honest, and for Emma, honesty was more valuable than perfection. Judge Henderson entered the courtroom at exactly 10 a.m., and everyone stood. The judge took her seat and looked directly at Emma before beginning to speak. "This case involves a question that I believe is central to all family law," Judge Henderson began, her voice steady and clear. "When parents separate, where does the child's best interest actually lie? I came into this case believing that the answer lay in carefully balancing parental rights, examining testimony, and applying legal precedent. I was wrong." She paused, letting that statement settle into the room. "The answer," she continued, "lies in ensuring that the child is protected from the conflict itself. Emma Rodriguez is a child who has been subjected to a custody battle that has caused her genuine psychological harm. She has developed selective mutism. She experiences severe anxiety. She has been pushed to the brink of psychological breakdown, not because of anything her parents intentionally did to her, but because she was caught in a war between 2 people who were so focused on fighting each other that they lost sight of the person they'd created together. Judge Henderson looked at both Marcus and Carolina as she spoke. "Here is my ruling. Emma will maintain equal custody with both parents, rotating weekly between households. However, this custody arrangement is conditional. Both parents must commit to immediate family therapy, not at some point in the future, but beginning within the next week. Both parents must commit to never speaking negatively about the other parent in Emma's presence or within her hearing. Both parents must commit to maintaining a respectful co-parenting relationship that prioritizes Emma's emotional well-being." She paused again, her gaze settling on Scout. "Additionally, Scout, Emma's emotional support animal, will be maintained in both households. Scout will be listed as part of the custody arrangement, and both parents will be responsible for his care and well-being. This may be unprecedented in family law, but then again, what happened in this courtroom was unprecedented." Judge Henderson then did something extraordinary. She looked directly at Dalton Price. "I am also issuing an order that the law firms representing both parties will each contribute $50,000 to fund a research initiative at Ohio State University, studying the effects of custody battles on children's mental health and the role of emotional support animals in therapeutic intervention." "This is not a sanction," she said, nodding Price's expression, "but rather recognition that this case has highlighted a gap in our understanding of how family law should serve children's actual needs rather than parental rights." Finally, Judge Henderson addressed Emma directly, speaking to the child rather than to the lawyers or the court. "Emma," she said, her voice softening, "I want to tell you something that I should have told you when you first came into my courtroom. I'm sorry. I'm sorry that the adults in your life put you in a position where you felt like you couldn't speak. I'm sorry that I forced you to testify when I should have recognized that you were trying to tell us something very important through your silence. And I'm sorry that it took a dog to teach me what I should have understood all along, that sometimes the most important thing adults can do is simply listen, not with our ears, but with our hearts." She paused, then added, "You're a very brave girl, and this dog," she gestured toward Scout, "is a very wise animal. Both of you have taught this court something invaluable." The ruling was extraordinary. It made legal headlines across Ohio and quickly spread to other states. Law review articles began appearing analyzing what Judge Henderson had done. Some praised her for prioritizing the child's emotional well-being. Others criticized her for making unprecedented decisions that went beyond traditional custody law. But what mattered most to Emma was something simpler. For the first time in 6 months, she didn't feel trapped. Her parents were still broken. Divorce had broken them. But they were no longer using her as a weapon against each other. The custody arrangement that Judge Henderson had implemented meant that Emma didn't have to choose. She could love both her parents without feeling like that love was a betrayal of the other. And Scout, listed in court documents as an official member of the custody arrangement, had become something more than a pet. He'd become a symbol of what happened when love was allowed to operate outside the constraints of legal procedure, when authentic connection was valued above strategic advantage. Judge Henderson's ruling would be appealed. It would be challenged. But ultimately, it would stand. And more importantly, it would change how family courts across the nation understood their responsibility to the children who appeared in front of them. All because a judge had finally learned to listen. 6 months after Judge Patricia Henderson's unprecedented ruling, Emma Rodriguez stood in the gymnasium of her elementary school, waiting to receive an award that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier, the principal's award for personal courage. She was no longer silent, not completely anyway. The selective mutism that had gripped her for so long had gradually released its hold as the adults around her stopped fighting and started healing. Her first words after the courtroom incident had come 3 weeks into the new custody arrangement, whispered to Scout in the darkness of her bedroom at her father's house. "I love you, Scout. Thank you for saving me." Scout had responded in the only way he knew how, with his head on her chest, his breathing synchronized with hers, his presence confirming what he'd been trying to communicate all along: that she was safe, that she was loved, and that she was going to be okay. The principal began speaking, describing how Emma had overcome tremendous adversity, how she'd shown resilience in the face of circumstances that would have broken many adults, how her courage in allowing herself to be vulnerable had inspired everyone around her. Emma's mother sat in the audience with tears streaming down her face. Her father sat 3 rows back, also crying, watching his daughter receive recognition for surviving the war he'd helped wage against her. What the principal didn't mention, what most people in the gymnasium didn't know, was that Emma's true award wasn't sitting on the gymnasium stage. Scout was home, resting in the sunny spot in the living room where he spent most afternoons, his work largely complete. He'd been Emma's therapist, her protector, her witness, and though he would never receive official recognition for it, the impact of what he'd done was rippling outward in ways that none of them could have anticipated. Judge Henderson's case had become something approaching legendary in Ohio's legal circles. Within 18 months, 12 other states had begun revising their custody procedures based on the Rodriguez decision. Legal scholars were teaching the case in family law classes across the country, using it as an example of how rigid adherence to procedure could obscure the actual needs of the human beings involved in litigation. More importantly, universities had begun funding research initiatives based on Judge Henderson's requirement. A team of psychologists at Ohio State, led by Dr. Patricia Winters, was conducting the most comprehensive study of emotional support animals in therapeutic settings that had ever been undertaken. Emma and Scout had participated in the research, with Scout's interventions being carefully documented and analyzed. The data they'd collected suggested that emotional support animals could be significantly more effective in helping traumatized children manage anxiety than many traditional therapeutic interventions. The research had already led to changes in how schools across Ohio addressed student mental health. Several districts had begun implementing programs where emotional support animals were integrated into school counseling offices. Children who struggled with anxiety disorders were being given access to therapeutic dogs, with Scout's case serving as the foundational evidence that such interventions actually worked. But the ripples extended far beyond schools and courtrooms. Emma's story had been picked up by a documentary filmmaker named Sarah Chen, who'd spent 6 months following the family, capturing the healing process as it unfolded. The resulting documentary, titled Silent Voice, had premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and had subsequently been acquired by a major streaming service. It had aired nationally and internationally, reaching millions of people with the story of a girl, her dog, and a judge who'd finally learned to listen. The documentary had sparked conversations about custody law in households across America. Parents who were going through their own divorces had watched it and been forced to confront their own behavior, their own willingness to use their children as weapons in their adult conflicts. Family law organizations had screened the film at conferences. Law schools had incorporated it into their curricula. Most remarkably, the film had inspired a movement. Organizations began forming across the country focused on what became known as child-centered custody reform. Their central premise was simple: family courts existed to serve children's needs, not parental rights. This wasn't a radical idea, but it was one that had become obscured over decades of legal practice focused on parental entitlements rather than children's well-being. Judge Henderson had become something of an unlikely celebrity. She'd been invited to speak at law schools and judicial conferences. Other judges had begun reaching out to her, asking for advice on how to implement similar approaches in their own courtrooms. Some of her colleagues criticized her for being too emotional, too soft, for allowing personal feelings to influence her judicial decisions. But Henderson had stopped caring about those criticisms. She discovered something more important than professional approval. She discovered the difference between justice as procedure and justice as genuine service to human beings. More personally, Judge Henderson had made a decision that shocked everyone who knew her. She'd reached out to her daughter, Rebecca, for the first time in 7 years. She hadn't expected forgiveness. She wasn't sure she deserved it, but she'd written a letter explaining how Emma's case had changed her, how watching that girl and her dog had made her realize what she'd lost in her own family by prioritizing rules over relationships. Rebecca had been cautious in her response, but a door that had been closed for 7 years had begun to crack open. Emma herself had changed dramatically. The girl who couldn't speak had become, over the course of 6 months, a girl who spoke carefully and purposefully. She joined the school's drama club, where speaking was not just allowed but celebrated. She'd made friends, real friends, not the careful acquaintances she'd maintained during her months of silence, but genuine connections with other children who valued her for who she was. Her anxiety disorder hadn't disappeared. The trauma of the custody battle had left scars that would probably take years to fully heal. But with consistent family therapy, with both her parents actively working to repair their relationship and their respective relationships with her, with Scout's constant presence and unconditional support, Emma had learned to live with her anxiety rather than be consumed by it. She'd also become something of an advocate herself. As she'd become more comfortable speaking, she'd begun talking about her experience to friends, to school assemblies, to anyone who would listen. She'd started a social media account documenting Scout's life and work, which had accumulated over 2 million followers. The comments on her posts were filled with stories from other people whose lives had been changed by emotional support animals, whose pets had helped them through their own traumas, their own impossible situations. Marcus and Carolina, Emma's parents, had surprised everyone, including themselves, by becoming genuine friends after the custody arrangements had stabilized. They would never be a couple again. The betrayal, the infidelity, the years of conflict had made that impossible, but they discovered that they could be co-parents who actually cooperated rather than competed. They'd gone to family therapy together for a year, and the experience had helped them process not just the divorce, but also their individual roles in creating the circumstances that had traumatized their daughter. Both had remarried within the next 2 years, to different people, in different cities, but they'd maintained the commitment to not badmouth each other in front of Emma, to present a united front when it came to parenting decisions, to remember that their personal conflicts didn't have to become Emma's conflicts. Scout, meanwhile, had become something approaching a celebrity in his own right. He'd been featured in national magazines. He'd appeared on talk shows. A toy company had created a plush Scout doll, with proceeds going to organizations that trained emotional support animals for children with anxiety disorders. Several books had been written about Scout's life, including a children's book titled Scout's Signal that had been distributed to thousands of schools across the country. But Scout's most important work remained unchanged, showing up every day for a girl who'd needed him, providing the grounding and support that no legal system could mandate, offering the unconditional presence that had proven in the end to be more powerful than any courtroom argument. On the day that Emma received her principal's award for personal courage, she stood at the microphone and spoke briefly about her journey. She talked about how hard it had been to be silent, how painful it had been to watch her parents fight, how terrified she'd been of the courtroom. And then she talked about Scout. "A lot of people have asked me why Scout ran to me in that courtroom," Emma said, her voice steady and clear. "They ask if I trained him to do it, if we planned it, if it was some kind of strategy. But the truth is much simpler than that. Scout did what he does every single day. He loved me. He noticed I was in trouble and he helped. He didn't care about custody arrangements or legal arguments or who was right and who was wrong. He just cared about me." She paused, looking out at the audience. "I think maybe that's what we all need to do sometimes. Instead of fighting about who's right, maybe we just need to notice when someone we love is in trouble and help them. That's what Scout taught everyone in that courtroom, and that's what I've learned from having him in my life." The gymnasium erupted in applause. Emma's mother stood and clapped, tears flowing freely. Her father stood as well, applauding his daughter's wisdom and her courage. Scout, home in his sunny spot, slept peacefully, unaware of the impact his simple act of love had created. But his impact continued to ripple outward, through courtrooms and classrooms, through law schools and psychological research centers, through the hearts of millions of people who'd watched Emma's story and been reminded that sometimes, when words fail us and systems fail us, love is the only thing that can save us. One girl, one dog, one moment of authentic connection in a courtroom filled with procedure and argument. That's all it had taken to change everything. Not just for Emma, not just for her family, but for an entire system that was finally beginning to learn what Scout had known all along, that the most important things in life cannot be won through litigation. They can only be nurtured through presence, through attention, through the simple, revolutionary act of showing up for someone you love, exactly as they are, in their moment of greatest need. This is the power of one moment, one gesture, one small hand signal that meant, "I need help." And a dog who answered. The end.